I've got stuff, yeah. All right. So you get these great colors. And so this is what we call umba salad. They say that cities formed when people decided to cook together. Cooking is alchemy. It's molded with hands and time and heat. And to me, there's a lot of similarities formally, with sculpture. Iraqi heritage to me was almost invisible because it was so normal. It was what I was growing up in. It was what my grandparents insisted on keeping alive. Even though they were forced to leave Iraq, they were heartbroken to leave. It was what defined them as Arab Jews. In the evening of January 17th, 1991, I remember sitting at the television while having dinner, watching for the first time in our lives real-time images of Iraq, of buildings that my brothers and I would never get to visit. And so suddenly I realized that the place that my grandparents fled to was destroying the place that they fled from. And that's when I really started to recognize what my life's work was going to be about. When I was in high school, I was exhibiting a drawing in the high school art show, and the dean of my high school, Peter DiFilippo, came to me during the exhibit and told me that I had the drawings of a sculptor. And he said that he was actually a stone carver and would I be interested in being his apprentice. It remains to date the material that I derive the most pleasure from working with. And so the first sculpture that I did at that age of 15 was a tribute to the Bamiyan Buddhas. The Hazara people that live in Bamiyan were also massacred in the aftermath. And I started to work with the same travertine that the Bamiyan Buddhas had been made from as a way of taking one cultural collapse to address another cultural destruction that happened during World War II with the burning of books. My parents had told me, the child of post-Holocaust Jews, that when books burn, people burn.
And then he brought some of the stone from the valley to Europe and worked with master stone carvers to reproduce the shapes of books that had been burnt in Europe during World War II. So it's a sort of a circle, a kind of ecology of materials.
How do you move forward without denying the past?
He works with issues and questions which are very timely, making compelling, potent works that speak both to his own personal history and to our times. Perhaps we see this very clearly in the fourth plinth, which is a work made on a pedestal in Trafalgar Square, a reference to and a version of an Assyrian bull, both witty and hard-hitting.
We live in a fragmented world, and Michael is an artist who deals with healing. He deals with the recovery of material that has been destroyed or lost.
A project of mine like Dull Roar the centerpiece of which is a recreation of one of the Pruitt-Igoe housing structures that was demolished in 1972, rising and falling, showing that the racial tensions that allowed for it to be destroyed, that rising and falling still happens today. It is one of those things where I recognize provenance again as being really important. The fact that the rubble of Pruitt-Igoe served as the foundation landfill for mansions to be built on top, that tells the whole story. And so we're reuniting this panel that was left behind in Iraq and was subsequently destroyed by ISIS in 2015 with the head that was removed from it in the mid-1800s.
These panels come from the Northwest Palace of Nimrud, one of the rooms destroyed by ISIS. They're not intended to fool anyone, and they're made from materials that are transient, that we would normally throw away.
The materials we're using to recreate the artifacts and also these panels are the packaging of Middle Eastern foodstuffs.
Green tea, for example. Along here are sardines.
The places we go to source the materials are actually grocers, emigres, and refugees that have fled the north of Iraq. My own curiosities that I developed throughout my life, whether it was the Beatles and the memorabilia around the band and wanting to know every little thing, would soon kind of train my brain with anything that I was interested in. And so a lot of the works that I do, I think you could look at them and say that in addition to making things, I also build collections. And so there's always a kind of continuous layering, one on top of the other, whether it's Middle Eastern food packaging or even pulling together objects that I feel tell a story. I'm pulling these things together, and that requires an immersive curiosity. It requires a certain amount of obsession.
Mother been able to return to, or any of your family?
No, we've never been back. In fact, you know, it's one of those things that I always find interesting in my work is that people have always thought that I have.
Right.
And there's something about that distance and being able to kind of have an intimate relationship with Iraq not being there that kind of speaks to, you know, the very real current condition. But I'm starting to get a lot of invitations, you know, to do something there, and so I'm thinking about what that would mean. Amba is a pickled mango. In Urdu means mango, and ended up on every Iraqi table and as a condiment in every Iraqi sandwich. That it was very much a part of, like, you know, the spice roads, but also British colonialism. And apparently a bottle of this was found in the little apartment refrigerator that Saddam Hussein had when they captured him in Iraq. When you think about food, the sensory experience is immense because you end up with a certain kind of DNA that comes out of the pots and the pans that, you know, has the smells of home, it has the colors, and of course the taste, and it becomes something that, for me, as a sculptor, I'm very interested in because it has that physical presence, not only in the way that it's made, in the way that it appears, but then also in the way that it's consumed, that there's a whole sort of like level of emotional communion that happens between the person and the object.
You speak Arabic?
شوي. من وين?
We are from Syria.
Syria. It's okay?
Okay.
Or smaller?
It's a little bit here.
A little smaller.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
عاشت ايدك Ready, Eisen?
I look back on that day in February, almost with having this meaning that we didn't know what it was going to have at the time.
Such an incredible time cooking for people from the Iraqi, the Syrian, the Afghanistan communities, and at farm, all the veterans that showed up.
What we see here today is incredible, and what we see in front of us is a city.
His, therefore, is a post-museum art. His objects are often damaged, broken, stolen, or burnt goods. His goal seems to be to find ways by which their embedded meaningfulness may emerge and flourish again. And his proposition is that this can happen only if we work together with others.
The work that we're doing right now that we don't know that we're doing is hopefully enzymatic work. In this moment, maybe it's like we're spoiled milk, but eventually we're going to be cheese,
That yeast that's gonna make the bread even better.
Right. or wine, right?
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Jeremy Strick, Director of the Nasher Sculpture Center. Welcome to the Nasher Prize Laureate Lecture with our 2020-2021 Laureate, Michael Rakowitz. The year 2020 proved to be an unforgettable one, of course. Every aspect of life, for people all over the planet, was dramatically altered by the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic. It was a year that tested the architecture of every institution, business, family, and individual, dealing out immeasurable loss and hardship to those in every walk of life. To no less a degree, we all experienced isolation, distance from community, fellowship, and the physical presence of many we love. The irony was not lost on us that when we were all forced to be apart, our laureate, Michael Rakowitz's entire artistic practice hinges on the belief that great benefits may be reaped and fostered through building community by spanning ethnic, social, religious, and political divides. But as Michael has made evident through his brave work, unforeseen impediments can often make us more resilient and imaginative, more resourceful, and we found such to be true when it came to shaping this year's Laureate Lecture, brought to you in this virtual format this year. I'm delighted to introduce Michael to all of you watching from around the world and trust that his talk will inspire and compel each of us to be better observers, better citizens of this planet, and better friends to each other. Michael?
Hello. I'm Catherine Kraft, curator at the Nasher Sculpture Center, and I'm here with Michael Rakowitz, that is virtually. Michael is in Chicago, and I'm here. And Michael, first of all, welcome. And second of all, this whole year up until this very moment has taken us on a very strange and unusual voyage. And I think we've arrived at a place of our conversation that is a little different from what either of us anticipated might be happening today.
It's great to be with you, Catherine, and it's great to be with everyone. I'm speaking to you today from the unceded territory of the Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Miamia, and the Ocheti Shakowin, the Council of the Seven Fires. Yes, indeed. I mean, we're having a conversation. This is not a lecture, and in true keeping with the year that we've had, one thing that I came to realize this week as we were trying to piece together a talk was that I cannot speak to a camera without somebody being on the other end. And so the need for social, the need for the social, the need for our connections, even in this virtual format, is something that we came to rely on for this talk, which is not just me talking, but all of us talking to each other. And so it's interesting on a day like this to be talking about, setbacks and the things that don't work in my work. Interesting beginning, but I really appreciate you and the Nasher being willing to change course and make this happen.
No, it's a delight and a pleasure, and it's also a bit appropriate because we were talking earlier, and I think you were exploring in the lecture that you were working on the question of substitution, which is very often an element of your practice, and that has become an element of today as well.
Yes, and as I was thinking about the word substitute, what was interesting was just diving into the etymology of it, which is a little bit like looking at the provenance of the words the same way that one looks at the provenance of materials or archaeological artifacts, the sourcing, where something comes from. And when I looked up substitute, and I found out that it comes from the Latin substituere, which comes from statuere, the noun derivative of which is statua or statue. It just seemed like an incredible development and epiphany in the way that I understand my own work and what a statue or a sculpture actually means. And especially in my work, when there's this kind of doubling that's happening, this desire to reappear things that have disappeared, I'm very aware of these things never being the actual thing, and that they are in fact placeholders and ghosts of the original.
You bring up the term ghost, which refers to other aspects of your practice, but I wanted to ask you about another word, a journey of a word, that word ghost, that I think is linked closely to the question of the substitute. And I think ghost is, it takes a bypass through another artist of the last century, Marcel Duchamp. But if you might talk about that idea of the ghost.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've been interested in exploring in my work is this concept of hosting. And the word host comes from the Latin hospice and hostis, which mean guest, stranger, but they also mean enemy. And so it makes one realize that all these words of host, but also hostility and hostage all come from this same root. And thinking about the way that you can have a space where hospitality and hostility connect was something that was very interesting to me, especially when I think about my works having a kind of museological element to them where they're presented and there is a certain kind of hosting or guiding through. And it happens in any kind of museological context, and it's something that I've played with in my work through my own voice as I bring viewers through the projects. But it also, for me, is interesting to think about it as something that's connected in the spelling of the word ghost. You just add a G to the word host. And I was first made aware of this when a close friend and an artist who I adore, Anna Pravatsky, made a cocktail as an artwork that was called the Ghostus. And it was a work that she based on a piece by Marcel Duchamp that he made for an exhibition in Paris that was a candy. And it was when you opened up the wrapper, this green foil had printed on it, a guest plus a host equals a ghost. And so when Anna did that work and she referenced that work, I started to think about how it connected to this practice that I have in reappearing the artifacts that were looted from the National Museum of Iraq in the aftermath of the US-led invasion. And all of those works that I reappear are made from the wrappers of Middle Eastern foodstuffs that one finds throughout the United States where there is an Arab community, and also the Arabic and English newspapers that one finds in those groceries where one buys the food. And those newspapers are actually geared towards newly arrived emigres and refugees from places like Iraq and Syria. And so you have in those newspapers current events, you have editorials, but you also have a lot of ads in there to help newly arrived people find the right lawyer for their asylum cases and where one can go to get a job or an employment service. So for me, it was a material that connected directly through Duchamp, but also it, for me, went in another direction, which was about also like finding these traces of cultural visibility that are enlisted to make these things that are no longer visible, but there are also traces of survival, of continuation, where people from those countries continue to make their food, they continue to live together, they continue to celebrate. So in the midst of these things that are being made that can never really be made again, there's also an insistence that we're still here, that we remain.
Well, what you're saying makes me think about two aspects of sculpture that I think connects to both of those things you're talking about, both with the substitute and the ghost, and the containment of host within that word. One of which is that in cast sculpture, like a bronze or plaster or such, the original is very often destroyed in the process of making the work, and that often that work of sculpture is a collaborative act, that it requires the participation and interaction with others. And when we were thinking about this event today, I think maybe initially one of the prompts or concepts you had around this weekend was, if I can't be with you, how can I show you where I am? And part of that is also where you are and who you are is also in part where you came from. And I have a photo of your, I think, grandfather's family that I was wondering if you can talk about a little bit where you come from and how that has fed into your work.
Well, my mother's side of the family, this photo that you're looking at is my grandfather, Nisim bin Ishaq Daoud Bet Aziz. And he's there with his family in Baghdad in the 1920s. And you can see the family is so large that they actually extend beyond the border of this desert oasis backdrop. And so my mother's side of the family comes from Baghdad. They were Jews that lived in the city for millennia, and they had to leave in the 1940s as these different nationalist programs started to emerge in West Asia. So you had Zionism on one side and then Arab nationalism on the other. And so as these two different programs started to kind of become dominant, it put Arab Jews in many of those countries in a kind of impossible situation. Any nationalist fervor that one sees throughout the world has always put minorities into horrible positions as one sees, for instance, in the case of the Armenian genocide in places like Turkey, and we're coming up on the anniversary of the Armenian genocide on April 24th. And so when I spoke with my grandparents about this, or really my grandmother, because she was alive for longer than my grandfather, what I understood was that it was always safe, that they loved being Baghdadis, they loved where they came from, but people also don't realize often that Iraq was also a battleground of World War II in many ways. And so when you have the combination of nationalist fervor in that region, and you have also the colonialist powers at war with one another in that same region, people like the Iraqi Jews were put into an impossible situation, and my grandparents ended up leaving shortly after an event called the Farhud, which means the violent dispossession, which was a couple of days of riots that happened in places like Baghdad and Basra against the Jewish population. And so you hear stories about that, and my grandparents did leave, but one thing that they made very clear, and a lot of the Iraqi Jews that I speak with all the time, is that for all those stories that do emerge about those riots, there were many neighbors of these families, and those neighbors were Muslim, they were Christian, it didn't matter. They also went to protect their Jewish neighbors. And so a lot of my work has been about centering, of course, this story of dispossession, because it seems as though that is the continuous Iraqi story. That when we talk about the Babylonian exile, the question is like, which one? You know, it's never just one time that's located in history. In biblical history, there's been many, and there's one happening right now. And so when I consider these stories about dispossession, I also think it's very important to talk about the fact that that wasn't necessarily the rule, and that we present a larger picture that pushes against the narratives of programs like Zionism, which always try to kind of create some kind of narrative that somehow the Iraqi Jews were saved by the creation of the State of Israel. And so it's about diving deeper and creating a more complicated narrative.
And I think crucial to that more complicated narrative is, as a kind of counterpoint to dispossession, is the concept of home and homeland, and also what it means to have or not have a home, or to be unhoused. And I'm just thinking that kind of placemaking or place finding really goes back to the very beginning of your work as an artist. I'm thinking about the project, the Parasite Project. And if you want to speak about that, I think we do have an image that, there it is.
This project is one that's been ongoing since 1997. I continue to do it every winter, and it's the custom-built inflatable shelters that I make for unhoused people in cities where I live usually. And it is, they're custom built. They're made out of rubbish bags and weatherproof plastic tape, and they attach to the exhaust vents of a building's heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system. So the warm air leaving the building simultaneously inflates and heats these double membrane structures. So it's kind of like a network of tubes that circulates the air around the person inside, so it heats through conduction and the person never comes into contact with the air in the ducts. Sometimes there can be mold spores in there and whatever else. So it's a little bit like taking an air mattress and pulling it around yourself. And the way that that project came about was studying with artists like Krzysztof Wodiczko, who's had an incredibly profound effect on my work as an artist and as a human being. And in the 1980s, he made a work called Homeless Vehicle. And I was studying with him at the time. And I did an architectural residency in Karak, Jordan, that was sponsored through MIT's Department of Architecture and Urban Planning. And when I went, I was very excited to go because it was actually the first time that someone from my family was going back to this area of the world, to a place other than Israel. And so going to Amman and being close, that much closer to Iraq, was something that I was very excited about. And I was also doing a lot of research at the time about the temporary shelters that are set up in the Palestinian refugee camps in Jordan. It was like this architecture of opposition. And one particular photo was of a house that had been bulldozed by the Israelis, and the family that had been displaced had recreated the facade of that house using plastic bottles and pieces of aluminum siding. And so when I saw that image, I became so interested in how there could be a ghost architecture that reappears as resistance. And while I was there, I also did all of this research on the tents and the equipment of the Bedouin, the nomadic dwellers of the desert. And one of the details that I learned was that the tents are set up differently every night to take into account the wind patterns that move through the desert. So every night it was a different shape, and the poles that held up the tapestries were reoriented depending on the direction and the speed of the wind. It was like the aerodynamics of sailing. And so when I got back to the United States with this information, I was walking down a street in Boston, and I saw an unhoused person sleeping underneath the vent of a building. And in French, the word vent is pronounced vent, and it actually means wind. And so this was the wind coming from the building's heating system that was keeping this person warm and alive for this night. It was in the winter, so it was very cold. But this was also not just another kind of wind, this was another kind of nomadism. Not the Bedouin who are nomadic by tradition, but the urban nomad or the unhoused person who is nomadic by consequence. And so with this cosmology emerging in my mind, I immediately thought about what it would mean to harness that air as a kind of invisible entity and to give it form through inflatable structures. And so that was where the project began. But then it went through the process of showing it as a kind of concept in architecture classes. And, architecture students love talking one another out of each other's ideas. And it wasn't until I showed the concept to a group of unhoused people that were living near my studio that I actually started to learn what it would take to make this project work.
And you've continued this project to the current day, and from that initial conversation with unhoused people, I think one of the interesting things and resonant things about that project is that it is collaborative. I mean, it's not a one-size-fits-all inflatable shelter. That it's developed in conversation with individuals, and also that some of the, correct me if I'm wrong, but some of the shelters also have space for some kind of sociability. I mean, more than one person can fit inside, or is that correct?
Yes, it depends. So in one case, after building shelters for individual people, one thing I noticed was that it wasn't always just about the needs that were being foregrounded in the designs that people proposed. It was also the desires. And so a project that was about architecture started to become also a little bit about portraiture. And one example of this that I love is a shelter that I designed for an unhoused man in New York City named Artie and his girlfriend Myra. And Artie wanted a kind of, it kind of looked like a shoe, the way that he gave me the drawing. It was like an area for him and Myra to sit and to talk to each other. And then a low-lying part of it that he called the lovin' room, which was the lovin' room. And he, after about, I don't know, 10 days of my work on the shelter, he came to me and he said, listen, you've got to change this because it's not going to work. And I asked him what was wrong, and he said, Myra talks way too much. And so what he wanted was 2 separate sitting rooms and the loving room in between. And he said it should look like a bra or a dog bone. And so these kinds of moments when people started to kind of think together about how they wanted to live together actually made them even more interesting, you know, but I always think that things are more interesting when there's more than one person involved. And I was invited by a contemporary art nonprofit in Ljubljana, Slovenia, to build a shelter for an unhoused person named Egon, who had seen a picture of the work in a newspaper and wanted me to come and build a shelter for him and 3 other people. And so they kind of referred to it as a hotel. And so there were all these interesting partitions that they asked me to build inside. But it also opens up, you know, the clarity of the fact that these are communities of people, of citizens that are living in our cities that have completely failed us in terms of the imagination that could be wielded about housing as a human right, not just as something that's affordable. And so it's a project that also problematizes the problem. It's a project where problem solving is also trouble making, in the sense that it is making the unhoused person more visible, where the city is always looking to kind of hide them.
That question of visibility also has a connection, I think, to what is perhaps your best known series of work or project, The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist. This is that was begun or inspired, spurred into being by the 2003 sacking of the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. And you have dedicated yourself since 2007 to trying to recreate objects that were destroyed or looted from that museum and that remain unrecovered, to which have been added objects that have subsequently been destroyed by ISIS. And in fact, here behind me are some of the latest works from the Northwest Palace of Nimrud that you and your studio have recreated. So you've spoken a little bit about how these works are made. They are ghosts, and they are reappeared created out of papier-mâché using the wrappings from foodstuffs and newspapers purchased here in this country. And one thing I wanted to sort of tease out of this is the idea that this is a collaborative project. It's something that requires it's a project that both in time and in space socially goes well beyond you, and that will continue into the future. And I just wonder, is it something you've been able to work on in the last, say, year or so?
Thankfully, yes. I think, at this moment, I want to thank every person who's worked in my studio on this since the process began in 2006. And it's important to say that there's 40 different pairs of hands that have made these works over the years. And so to my current studio team, I send out my deepest gratitude and love to them for enduring this last year. We, as you said, have made large objects like the ones that are behind you, that are these reliefs that were destroyed in Nimrud in 2015, and the way that the studio is set up now, we're able to do those large works in what's basically a converted floor of my family's home. But when the pandemic when the pandemic became what it is and lockdown happened, we weren't able to work as a team any longer, and so we had to shutter the studio. But we continued the work because, unfortunately, there are 8,000 of those smaller artifacts, like the ones that are behind. I guess this, I don't know which side it is. I can't see the mirror image on the screen, but whatever. You see them behind me. So these works are handheld, basically, because they were the works that were looted from the museum in 2003. And like I said, there's still 8,000 of those artifacts that are still at large. Mm-hmm. And so this is a work that will outlive me and my studio. Since 2006, we've made about 900 of these objects. So clearly, it's a work that's bigger than a lifetime, and that's kind of the point. So we were able to work remotely on those things together. And so we've done check-ins. We, for a time, had a kind of social hour on Fridays, but some of the brightest moments in this pandemic period has been when the studio team has come back here to pick up some materials, and we'll have, a kind of socially distant distribution of those materials outside, and everybody gets to see one another. But when we think about these objects from earlier civilizations, we realize that all of those votive sculptures that were made, for instance, that were in the Iraq Museum, were all made by different people. And so it was a kind of reflection of a city through the artisanship. And so I love the fact that there's different hands on these, that they all have their different characteristics. And I can't wait until we're all able to be together in the studio again.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the really interesting aspects of your project is, it's already a sweeping sort of narrative to discuss the trajectory of these very ancient objects and their discussion and their looting and going missing and often being destroyed. But, I've referred to the works here at the Nasher, and one behind me, and I'm seated against a backdrop that is very dark, and it actually represents a part of the relief that was not in situ, destroyed by ISIS, but represents something an absence, something quite different. And I think that element is also really important to this work that you do, which is in fact that this relief was not destroyed because it was taken out of the site in the 19th century by European archaeologists. Could you talk a little bit about that, how that more complicated history fits into or evolved as you began this project with what happened at the Iraq Museum, but I think it's really grown and deepened in complexity as you've been involved with it.
Yes, and I think for me, it's important that the work more or less convey that this is not a story that began and ended with ISIS in 2015. In fact, it does begin with the excavations by different European archaeologists like Austin Henry Layard in the middle of the 19th century and into the early part of the 20th century and up until now. And so when it comes to the Northwest Palace of Nimrud, we're talking about a palace that was made by Ashurnasirpal II in the mid-9th century BC. And it was a sprawling palace that had about 600 of those reliefs that are behind you, all of them different, obviously, conveying a kind of storytelling and a kind of consecration of the kingdom and protective deities for the kingdom. When Layard found Nimrud when Layard came to Nimrud in the mid-1800s, it began a process where 400 of those 600 reliefs were then taken out of what is now modern-day Iraq and sent to different Western institutions. And so the project is really about presenting a palimpsest of all these different moments of removal. And one thing that happens in that palimpsest is, as in the reappearance of room F that you have in the Nasher right now, what's behind you, it's not only the reliefs that are being reappeared, we're also reappearing as a team the spaces, the gaps that represent those reliefs that were taken by the West. So in room F alone, there's many reliefs that were taken. One of them resides at the Brooklyn Museum in New York. And so what one sees is not a room that's been made whole, but you're seeing exactly to the centimeter the measurements of that room as it would have appeared when Ashurnasirpal built it. But you're also seeing it the same way that an Iraqi would have seen it the day before ISIS destroyed it. And so you're seeing all the gaps and the empty spaces that Iraqis have had to look at their history through. And so that black space that you're talking about behind you is actually one of the most awful techniques that was developed by the excavators when there were Western institutions that did not want to pay for an entire slab for the shipping. The excavators came up with a technique where they could simply chisel off the head of one of the deities, for instance, because a museum would think that their audience would react or relate better to that one portion. So like slicing a pat of butter off of this gypsum. And so you end up with these beheadings of the sculptures that actually end up being a horrible symmetrical reference to the beheadings of the citizens of places like Nimrud in Iraq when ISIS took over. And for me, that is very much an important part of it, is to understand that, like, in this frenzy that the West has through another kind of archaeological colonialism to say that like we can just 3D print these spaces. You can't 3D print the DNA of the people that perish alongside a site like Palmyra. You can't 3D print the DNA of the Palmyrean people. And so it's important to know that what you're looking at is also an instance where if we were to go back to that time in 2015 and imagine ISIS saying, we have 200 remaining panels in this palace and we're going to destroy them unless you take them, every museum in the Western world would have pressured and succeeded in getting their country's borders to open up to receive those panels. But if ISIS said we're going to kill 200 Yazidis and Assyrians in Mosul unless you take them, I can guarantee you every country's borders would have stayed closed.
And I think that's something that appears over and over again, that sometimes the Western response to the destruction of patrimony is more intense than the response to loss of human life. I want to also point out, though, one of the things that adds real richness to your work, and it's a detail that's easy to miss, and I'll use the works in this gallery as an example. Often if you go to some place like the British Museum, that have these reliefs, there'll be a label on the floor or mounted to the wall that explains where they came from and may tell you what this god or that flower symbolizes. And what these panels here have are quotes and comments from archaeologists, scholars, but also Iraqis who lived nearby and who knew these places before these objects were destroyed. And I think having those voices is such a powerful thing, and to demonstrate that this is not just a critique of something that is distant. The critique is essential and important, but or that part of the critique is also seeing that there's a thriving, living culture of people who, in situ, who embrace and celebrate that work, as well as here. And I think that element of emotional attachment and joy and family and connection brings me to another aspect of your work that I want to be sure that we touch upon, and that is the relation to food and cooking and the communal activity that is every bit, I think, is important, a counterpart to your practice as sculptures and objects that are easy to pack up and travel around and put on display. But you have also linked this very closely to the practice of preparing and sharing food. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you for bringing it up. And also, I want to express my deepest thanks to everyone at the Nasher. This whole experience has been like wonderful and also heartbreaking that we're doing this, that we can't be together. But one thing I will always be thankful for is the way that the Nasher put together with Break Bread, Break Borders, that wonderful barbecue that we did in February of 2020. To think that we were able to get that done just before we all went into lockdown, I feel very lucky. And one of the things that has been a kind of almost psychoanalytic moment in my work, when I started to do projects about cooking, it really came from just the proximity that I had to my parents that my parents have been profoundly influential on my work. My mother is from Baghdad, my father's from Brooklyn, and the recipes that my grandmother would make, that my mother makes even better, and that she's taught to me and my brothers, has been that kind of transmission of what it means to stay connected to a place like Baghdad, even when you're not there, that there can be this kind of magic thing that happens when you make a meal that is a portal to that place. And you even have, like, you know, on the stove, this magical moment when you have the transmogrification of the different like proteins that become something else, and a smell that comes out of it. And it's like, it really is magical. And my father, who's a doctor and who's devoted his life towards a real commitment to healing and what it means to mend the breach, has been important in that narrative about continuing these things and making sure that even though there's been a rupture where a family has been, that you can continue those things. And those moments of the substitution in a recipe can be seen as, like, you know, the scar that even though you can't get the actual thing, the substitution lets you know that you're far from that place, but you're still there, and you're still trying to make the presence happen. And so when the first Iraq War happened, the Gulf War in 1991 happened, it was a war that was televised. And so I remember being, I think, 16 or 17 years old at the dinner table. And now, for the first time, I was seeing Iraq in real time. But these were the green-tinted CNN images of buildings that I would never be able to visit being blown apart. And I realized how split I was in that moment, that the place that my grandparents fled to was destroying the place that they fled from. And I think my mother saw the way that this was affecting me and my brothers, and she drew our attention away from the television. She said, "Do you know there's no Iraqi restaurants in New York?" And it was like this riddle of the Sphinx, because my mother's an amazing cook. She could open up the first Iraqi restaurant in New York. But I think what she was pointing out to us in that moment was that Iraqi culture was not visible beyond oil and war. And so as the drums began to beat towards war with Iraq in 2003, I had this idea to collaborate with my mother to make those recipes, her recipes and my grandmother's recipes, available to publics, and to cook with them, and to create a kind of social space where we're making Iraqi food. But I also have made work for long enough in all different materials to know that when your hands are doing something, it frees your mind up to do something else. Mm-hmm. And I started to see a lot of platforms for public dissent disappear during the Bush era and during the war. And so we started to do them with school kids, many of whom were not allowed to talk about the war, or whose teachers were told not to bring up the war in classrooms because they had families stationed there and it was too incendiary a topic. And when I thought about, somebody who was in the age range of 12, to 17, who by 2003 had already spent several years living in a war culture, that nobody thought to ask them what they were feeling about it, that these workshops were a way to actually get at those questions. And so it eventually evolved into many different projects that involved cooking. But I think for me, the most important thing was recognizing the way in which an entire community would come together to make these works. And it wasn't clear to me at the very beginning, how it is that I would go from working with architecture in cities to suddenly being in a kitchen. But in 2005, Michael Pollan wrote a book called The Omnivore's Dilemma, and he actually gives a history lesson in there that says that cities formed when people decided to cook together. And so this cooking together is also, for me, a demonstration of why it is that we want to live with one another in the first place. And to be able to see my practice as something that began with a kind of interest in buildings, it quickly moved past the facade of buildings and actually into the heating system. And I mentioned before that those shelters were projects that were less about architecture in the end and more about portraiture. And now being able to kind of go even further into those spaces and into the kitchen and recognize that that's where the warmth is. I mean, that's where everybody ends up during a house party anyway. So I've often talked about my grandparents as being the first installation artists that I have ever met, because the house that they made for us in suburban New York, everything that was on the walls was from Iraq, and the things that were on the floor were from Iraq. What was coming out of the stereo during family celebrations was from Iraq, and what was coming out of the kitchen was most definitely from Iraq. And so I've started to kind of realize that my grandmother was able to cast the entire house in the smell of Iraqi Bahrat, long before Rachel Whiteread cast an entire house in concrete.
That's a lovely parallel. And I mean, there's so many additional projects that we could talk about and explore. I think what I do want to do, I want to check and see if we have some questions, maybe from people who have been watching, and invite people to put questions into the chat. I may start, even though I've been asking you questions as we've gone along, I might start with one of my own, which I think you've described yourself, and I think it's a wonderful way to think about it, as a site-specific artist. And I'm just wondering how the last year has it, and this may be an almost unanswerable question, but the site to which I think many of us, those of us fortunate enough to have homes, have been confined during lockdowns. And I just wonder if you have a sense of how the site that you've spent so much time in, that we've all spent so much time in the last year, has had an effect on how you'll think about your work going forward.
It's a great question, and I think I'm coming to terms with that now, and I don't have an easy answer for it. I thought I was doing well, during this whole time, but I realized the more I do things like this with people like you, how much I miss this, how much I miss these conversations, and I feel as though this year has really been about triage, so I've been homeschooling, remote schooling our kids since March of last year, and that's been a silver lining in all of this, the ability to be around family more. Teaching online has been sometimes rewarding because it's offered more things that I didn't expect it was going to offer. But I also miss a lot of the in-person, and also advocating on behalf of students who I want to make sure are getting all the tools they need in order to go out into the world. And so you find yourself sometimes really advocating and in conversations with larger institutions that can't always give you the things that you're asking for. So those things have been taking up a lot of time, but, there's also been moments like, behind me over here is, craft projects that I've been doing with my kids, making helmets out of duct tape and buckets and things like that. those have been rewarding, but in terms of what it's going to do, site specifically for my work, I'm not sure. I don't have an easy answer, but one thing's for sure, I don't think I'll ever take for granted again, the ability to be with somebody in the same space and have a meal, being able to do something like a site visit. Those things will never be the same for me again, and I'm looking forward to treating them with more care as I go forward.
I do have I've gotten a few questions in if you're game.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. This one ties in, I think, somewhat to the. Sorry, it just came through. This ties into what you were just talking about. That when you were talking about the importance of your grandparents' Iraqi heritage, describing them as the first installation artists that you knew. How do you and your wife approach cultural storytelling in your own home, and what new narratives are being told?
This is a great question. Well, for me, I think one of the reasons why I was not happy delivering a lecture where somebody else wasn't on the other end of the conversation was because I have a hard time acting, and that means that, like, what I'm putting into my work is often what I'm putting into my everyday. I don't mean to sound trite like that, but I try to create the conditions in my work that I can live by, and the things that I say in the work are the things that I say. And so, the storytelling that happens in our house is something that is not separate from the work. And so my wife, who is an art critic and a writer, and an art historian, Laureate Waxman, her family is from Quebec, and her family has a history in Eastern Europe. So we talk about, of course, lineages, but when it comes to a place like Iraq, the kids are aware of what that means right now. And my son, actually, we went to a restaurant that I'll probably send the great camera crew who's here, making all of this happen. They're just down the road, Milo's Pita Place. They're the restaurant that I work with on the Enemy Kitchen food truck. And I took my son Jude there one day after a swimming lesson, and he said, Dad, I know you're only half Iraqi, but I'm 100% Iraqi. and I love those new terms, being able to kind of declare that. And so the kids help with the cooking, and there's going to be a continued sort of like translation. You mentioned casting before, and one of the things that's beautiful about casting is that the mold, which has seen the original, can transmit its touch of the original to the new material. And so I think of that very much about like the way in which all of this is now being transmitted to our kids, but I also want them to be who they are, so to give them space to tell their stories.
Right. Here's another question. Are monuments to historically bad people important parts of cultural heritage? Are there compelling ways to make use of them rather than destroying them?
Well, I mean, this is a project. I mean, this is a topic that I think is not a question to direct only one person. But I do think it's something where when we ask the question, we have to really ask ourselves how sincerely we're asking it, and if there aren't better questions to be asked than just that. Whenever it comes to issues like this, I really want to be led by the people that the monument or the work is speaking to, and it can, and whether it's speaking to them in a traumatizing way, or if they have questions about it, I want to hear those questions. Mm-hmm. And I also want to know what it is that we can do as a society, and thinking about, yes, certain monuments that do need to be removed, and thinking about how it is that we can make it clear that there has been a wound that's been visited, and not to just make the wound disappear. I think about these things falling into the same, I think about programs like this potentially falling into the same trap as apology. Like I firmly believe in removing monuments to the Confederacy, because these are about a certain kind of revision, and our legacy of not actually having reckoned with racism in this country is the most profound or the most consistent American legacy. And I'm very grateful for the people that are leading movements to have us have these difficult conversations. And when I think about the danger of thinking that one can just remove a monument or repatriate an artifact, for instance, and then that the conversation ends there, then I think we'll have failed. Because apology is often said for the person saying the apology, to unburden them from guilt. It rarely heals the person who hears the apology. Apology may be a step in what one could see as a kind of restorative practice. But restorative practices are usually these things you have to come back to continuously. Mm-hmm. So if the removed monument becomes a site where we can go back and return to it and understand that place as being a place where harm has been emitted from, I'd be interested in that. But I would be interested in talking with artists from all different communities and backgrounds who have not been given the platform to speak about this, and hear what their ideas are. And those are conditions that I think we have to create the conditions in which those fearless conversations can actually happen. Yeah. I think about also, to be clear, like we're not always in the body of the person that's being traumatized by these works. And if I think about what it meant, I mean, they recently changed the name of the airport, but Ataturk Airport in Istanbul, I mean, for an Armenian to land at Ataturk Airport in Istanbul would be like a Jew flying to Berlin and landing in Hitler Airport. Yes. So I think these things do need to be reckoned with, but I think I want to center the people directly affected and to have them lead the conversations.
Yes, I think we need to begin to wrap up, but I will offer one more question. This comes from Dr. Nada Shabut, who is, for others watching,
hi, Nada.
A friend and a colleague to Michael, who also very graciously did a wonderful job moderating our graduate symposium dedicated to Michael's work. From Nada, have you connected with the art or artist community in Iraq?
I have had some brief not brief conversations, but I've had some conversations. I do know young Iraqi artists who have recently left Iraq like Alias and Ali Eyal, who I was introduced to by our mutual friend Regine Sahakian. And more recently, I've been involved with a young filmmaker who's made a film that I don't know that I'm at liberty to talk about, but I've served as a kind of like artistic or kind of like a producer, a design producer, an artistic advisor, because they wanted to incorporate some of the ethos of the material culture that's in my work into this narrative. And so I've been contacted by artists there, and it's been an honor to be in conversation with people who are there. And inshallah, one day I'll be able to go there and to meet them. But one thing I do want to point out is that Dr. Nada Shabut has given us the gift of concentrating on so much of the contemporary and modern work that has been really kind of like overlooked when it comes to our conversations around Iraqi art, that it's always located into these kinds of like earlier iterations, in the case of like the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And the West loves to call those things ancient. And that's a very violent word because it separates the work from the current people, the people today. For instance, the Assyrian people who still practice their language and traditions. So what Nada has done is she's interrupted that cycle, but has also really kind of centered the work of the modernists and the contemporary artists in Iraq, and has also given a lot of space for us to talk about those artworks that disappeared, that nobody has been talking about. And so when I do want to know about an Iraqi artist, a contemporary Iraqi artist, it's usually Nada that I'm calling first. And Nada was the first person to ever invite me to Dallas back in 2007. So I'm grateful for the question.
Well, and we will, I hope that very soon you'll be able to come to Dallas again and see Nada and everyone you met here when you were fortunate. We were fortunate enough to have our event in February, last February. But I want to thank you so very much, Michael, for joining us, and also just for being, this is not adequate praise, perhaps, or it's in a strange term, but the best laureate I can imagine for such a strange and difficult period. You've been unfailingly generous with your time to everyone here and to our larger community. And your artists don't have to be, I think sometimes we're a little unfair expecting that artists be a certain type of person because they're already making their work, and that's already a very difficult challenge. But in your case, there is a real flow between your work and your actions and your words and your presence. And I feel very honored to have had this extended period of time to be involved with you and your work over the course of this Nasher Prize period. And I'd like to invite anybody in Dallas. These reliefs that I've been referring to behind me will be on view through the weekend. They've been, we've extended the loan of them multiple times, and for that we're also grateful to Michael and his galleries. But I'd encourage anybody who can to come and see them. They're truly glorious. And Michael, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you so much.
All right.